This war is a violent demographic engineering, a purposeful breaking of places and communities, a deconstruction of a country, a separation of people from land. 10 million plus people, thousands of homes, thousands of communities destroyed and territories destroyed, thousands of kilometers poisoned by remnant munitions and landmines. Now, these enormous statistics can numb us to the fact that there are stories of stress, suffering, and pain behind every single one of these figures. This is enormous land grab. It's the largest we have seen on the European continent since the time of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, territorial revanchism is a messianic form of geopolitics. Europe did see in the early 1990s the emergence of a revanchist geopolitics in Serbia under Slobodan Milosevic as the Yugoslav Federation disintegrated. Now, the idea is to take back or to recover territories that radical nationalists believe primordially belong to the core state. So Serbia sponsored separatist militias in Croatia and Bosnia in order to create a new territorial and demographic order. Putin is, in many ways, following in the footsteps of Milosevic. His war is a war against actually existing Ukraine, against Ukrainians in the name of historic myths. He sees himself correcting historic injustices and mistakes. It is also a deeply self-serving war, a war in which he is the hero of his own violently imposed drama. Putin imagines himself as a man of steel or a man of iron, fighting once more a great patriotic war against fascist enemies at the gate. And tragically, Russian revanchism in Ukraine is on a much greater scale than anything Serbia and its proxies were able to violently impose on Bosnia-Herzegovina. Before February 2022, Russia controlled about 7% of the territory of Ukraine, annexing Crimea right away in March 2014 and controlling separatist groups in the Donbass. After this second invasion, the invasion of February 2022, Russia seized more than a quarter of Ukrainian territory, approximately 27%, before determined Ukrainian resistance drove it back. It currently occupies roughly 18% of Ukraine. Russia's invasion has generated the largest and fastest migration crisis in Europe since the Second World War. To date, Russia's war against Ukraine has generated approximately 6.5 million refugees, people who have left the country in search of safety. Now, the majority of these are women and children, as well as the elderly, with most being accommodated in states across the European Union. Poland deserves special commendation for accommodating more than 1 million Ukrainians at the outset of the war. And Germany now hosts the largest number of Ukrainians in Europe, while countries like Czechia host the largest number per capita. And my own home country of Ireland currently accommodates more than 104,000 Ukrainian refugees. Since the initial wave of displacement, there has been a pendulum of migration, brief returns by Ukrainians and then departures, because there's been separation of families. There's an estimated 3.7 million internally displaced persons currently living within Ukraine. The February 2022 invasion greatly accelerated the process of cultural and linguistic Ukrainianization within the country's society and population. It was impossible to still foster ideals about Russia except for older, deeply Sovietized groups. More Ukrainians started speaking Ukrainian in public, more rejected Russian Soviet memory politics, and more repudiated Russian cultural levers of influence in Ukraine, like the Moscow Patriarchy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But instead of seeing these societal changes in terms of geopolitics and identity, it is important to remember that first and foremost, Ukrainian society is now a nation of loss, pain, and suffering. Thousands have been wounded, and thousands now carry trauma and mental wounds from this war. This will exercise a profound effect on post-war Ukraine and indeed on all Ukrainian communities worldwide. Russia has reintroduced war as state policy to European political life. Its invasions of Ukraine have had global, indeed planetary impacts, as well as continental and regional ones across former communist lands. In the decisive decade of the fight against climate change, Russia's invasion has thwarted any hope of concerted collective effort by the great powers in the near term to prohibit the emissions that drive global warming. Climate change will be the greatest threat to the territorial integrity of states in the future, and this war has accelerated that outcome, unfortunately. Russia's invasion had an initially sobering effect on rising tension in the Balkans, particularly in Bosnia. Subsequently, though, the war has deepened divides in the region between Republika Srpska's leadership, Bosnian state officials, and European Union officials, and also between Serbia and Kosovo. Illiberal political forces across Europe and indeed across the world have taken inspiration from Putin's challenge to the liberal hegemony of Western powers. It should be recalled that Russia's initial invasion plan suggested it hoped to drive all the way to Transnistria. In other words, to invade Moldova as well as Ukraine. Moldova is a somewhat neglected second front on the Russia-West divide. Russia supported Transnistria, the de facto entity within Moldova, still receives subsidized Russian natural gas via Ukraine. And Ukraine is in a position to end that link this year. And so we may see a crisis in Moldova soon. This awful war has worked its way into politics and everyday life across the globe. It's a significant issue now in American domestic politics and in demagogic politics around immigration in the European countries. We can only hope that we're not marking a third anniversary of the war next year, but talking instead about reconstruction and peace. But the current situation is grim for Ukraine and its people, and they deserve our help.